Uh, I'm Ravikant, and I welcome you all to CSTS and to this book launch by three Bihari, edited by three Bihari boys. Uh, on behalf of the staff and faculty of CSTS, I welcome you all to this very happy occasion. I see friends all around, so it's going to look more like those tarpan than lokarpan, meaning that you release it in front of your friends rather than a public, which is, but since it is being recorded and because the earlier proceedings also of the two workshops from the project have been uploaded, this may be uploaded, this discussion as well. And I was wondering as I looked around whether the names of the discussants and the are names taken by servants in North India or South India, I don't know much about. And I was, Prabhu, you'll find lots. Deepu's lucky, he's Avdhendra and Deepu both. So Deepu saves him. Pankaj, I think, yes, is picking up as far as servant names would be concerned. Farhat Saab, I don't know about the Islamic culture so much. Farhat name, is it a common name for servants? I was just wondering. This is just to, start, and I'll give the mic to Prabhu, who's the chair. And but before that, release the book, all of you. Thanks, Orient Black Swan, for taking part in the entire process and bringing the book out in time. And looks like a nice cover to both the volumes. So let's release it first. And then Prabhu takes over.
Ravikant, I also extend my welcome to all of you who have come here for this, I hope, interesting and illuminating discussion on what I would say is a path-breaking work, path-breaking in many ways. But I just want to first lay out what we would going to do. We would have each of our panelists would speak for about 10 minutes on themes which I think they know what they're going to speak on, given the vast spread over time of this book. It may be important to just to focus on some themes, and we'll have discussion around it. My job is not merely to also to make it as very much required by Nitin, that should be somehow more conversational and you can bring out, of course, not many of you have read the book, but many of us were part of the conferences which went into this book. And so just to briefly set the context, one theme about this book is the ubiquity of the servants and their absence in historiography. This particular conundrum is something which is thrown open in this book. Just to put another context to it, today there were two news reports which I want to just flag for you. One has come from, in New York Times, is a fascinating essay, pictorial essay of the last, so-called last Nawab of Awadh, who lived in Malcha Mahal for last 30 years, from 1984 onward, 35 years, and the family, which is now gone. And as it turns out, this essay points out that actually there were imposters. They were just people who were normal families, but who had migrated to Pakistan and came back and took on the role of the Awadh Nawab. And it happened, Queen of Awadh. And as it happened, she arrived on the platform of Delhi station and stayed there for 7 years. Till Indira Gandhi gave the Malcha Mahal to them. And one of the things was, amongst the photographs there, is of course how can there be a queen without a servant? Not just a servant, she had got a retinue of Nepali servants who, this writer writes, would often go on their knees. They don't even walk to her, would walk on their knees or crawl to her on the knees to carry information. Someone wants to ask a question to the queen, it has to be carried by the Nepali bearer, whom I don't know how they maintained it, but the servants were there. Without the servant, even this household of royal household couldn't have existed. And that's one. The second is a news report which came out in Indian Express about its servant. As it happens, she was ultimately from Jamshedpur, where Pankaj comes from, where I have also. She picked up a very, very rare watch. Only A-lister, high socialite of international socialite in Cannes Film Festival every year. This company called Chopard, a French company whose watches are very, very rare. The master had got it, and the servant flinched, took it off, and she was found out. So again, another theme of both of intimacy, the awareness that this is valuable, and the news report ends with a statement that she wanted a high lavish lifestyle and some land. That was her idea of independence. It takes this very, very high-priced 25 lakh watch or something like that. Anyway, so just to point out that these themes are central to, and there are some mighty punches in the book. They've landed in the right places. Most of it, of course, going to labor historians, and which is so I have taken the punches. I'm still standing for that, and hope I'll be able to talk a little bit about that. But before that, let me just say that this is about servants past, largely focused around what is called South Asia, but which is actually North India. It's most of its essays are North Indian essays. Not most, all of it practically are North Indian essays. And it spans a large time expanse. Even though it doesn't cross the Vindhyas, it does cross the ocean to opens up to global history of servitude on the one hand, and most importantly, it looks at the history of the household on the other. So it is both opening up to a wide expanse over time. I think it's very difficult. I don't know how my fellow panelists would handle it. So we would go by the standard Delhi University division between ancient, modern, and ancient, which this book, in fact, is actually one of the contributions of this book is to put all these temporal structures into the same page, at least to understand over the same. So I would ask Meera Vishwanathan to begin, and we'll have 10, 12 minutes. I will not. I'll not stop you, Meera. You'll yourself.
Okay. Thank you, Nitin Verma and Pankaj Jha, for what is an exceptional book. I must say that I have only read volume 1, so I can't comprehend the totality of the project, but some of the things I have to say respond not just to the volume, but to the articulation of the project as a whole. As Prabhu pointed out, I enter this debate as a historian of the ancient past, but also as someone who has tried to engage with the limits and possibilities of long-term social histories. As a woman with 2 small children, let me use this occasion to record my debt to Nishu, Reshmaji and Geetaji, whose labor made it possible for me to frame this interjection. Since we operate within a structure of asymmetries, we must recognize them before we begin to understand their silences. This is an exercise that these books attempt, for they repeatedly ask what it means to recover these histories. Servants Past constitutes a contribution to several emerging fields, to histories of the body, of emotion and affect, of the household, of family and of politeness. It also helps us rethink several existing fields, whether labor history, histories of state structures or social histories. It is a volume rich in reflection, but often unwieldy given the weight of these reflections. In the time that I have for discussion, I cannot do justice to each of the essays in this volume, remarkable as they are. Instead, I will try and reflect upon some of the concerns of the project and the implications of what the essays say. Let me try and frame my response in terms of 3 or 4 key questions. Let's begin with the question of defining the category of servant. You could argue that 2 volumes have been spent around this question, so why am I posing it again? I do this because I want to raise the question of the usefulness of this category for the pre-modern period. In her pioneering essay on dasas and kammakaras, Uma Chakravarti pointed to the fact that there existed a spectrum of servitude that we need to be aware of. This is an insight that this volume consciously builds upon. In that sense, one could argue that rather than looking at the servant as a category, it looks at servitude as a range of relationships. But I would argue equally that just as there is a spectrum of servitude, there is a spectrum of service that we need to be conscious of. Thus, how do we relate the labor of a servant to that of a water bearer or a dhobi who serves a range of households and is not fixed to a single home, to that of the shagird, a disciple of a master who is set various laboring tasks in the household but is not a servant? How do we understand the labor of a woman who finishes her household work at home before appearing to serve the master or mistress? All these experiences are, of course, linked to how we envision the household as a site of economic activity. As a result, it seems to me that it would be useful to differentiate conceptually at least between service, servitude and slavery, understanding that they represent a range of possibilities at any given point, which is something that the essays in this volume do rather well. I think this is necessary because rather than giving endless elasticity to a category, you sometimes need to pin things down to help analysis, right? And the reason I make this point is because if I look at the range of groups whose histories this first volume reconstructs for the pre-colonial period, right? These are either groups at the top end of the spectrum, so concubines, kayasthas, elite slaves, or those at the absolute bottom, right? Slaves. So that's a question that I think we need to engage with, that if we understand that there is this spectrum, then why is it that our studies cluster at the 2 ends? What happens to groups in the middle? Because it's only when we enter the colonial period that often malis and masalchis, palanquin bearers and water bearers start entering the conversation. So I think there are a certain set of questions that we need to start asking about our sources. How do we explain this? Is it because these categories do not exist earlier? This is clearly not the case. Is it because the sources are framed by the masters and so we are limited in terms of the worlds that we can reach out to? I'm not necessarily convinced by this. The issue to my mind has to do with how we frame the question of servitude or servility in terms of the relationship between caste and class. Often this exercise is difficult because it requires that we imagine into life a past that is different from the present we know. Certain kinds of service categories, let's say pan bearers, oil sellers, mahouts, either no longer exist, or where they do, they are no longer part of our daily lives. The nature of caste formation has also meant that new categories of laboring groups could keep appearing and disappearing in the record. And further, these questions have to be understood in relation to changing social formations and not just political regimes. So let me take an example by what I mean. So the introduction, for instance, glosses the word dasa to mean slave, which of course it does. But looking at the long history of the term, at its range of meanings and usages, you see that actually there are several shades of meaning that the term acquires over time, right? And that these meanings change with time. So if we look at the point of its emergence in the Rig Veda, it's actually an ethnic designation. The dasas and the dasyus are the opponents of the Aryas. We know that in the transition from the early Vedic to the later Vedic, even if you don't want to use these categories, the dasyus are eventually wiped out and the term dasa comes to mean slave. Fine. Now, if you move to the early historic, in a context where there is wage labor, the dasa kammakara represents a range of serving groups, with the dasa representing unfree labor. In the early medieval context, however, the term comes to be used with new meanings. The Allahabad Prashasti of Samudragupta, for instance, one of the most famous kind of texts of Sanskrit epigraphy, has its composer Harishena, who we know is a Sandhi Vigrahika, a Kumara Matya, and a Mahadandanayaka, Yashodhara also refer to himself as the dasa of the king, right? He's clearly not a dasa. And in the medieval bhakti hymns, the term comes to be used by the saints to refer to their bond with the Lord. So in each changing context, the word acquires completely different shades of meaning. But the term dasi, on the other hand, has a completely different history, showing how the experience of servitude was often different for women and men. Consequently, it seems to me that there's a need to caution against using the rhetoric of servility to understand the experience of servitude, which is something I feel that several of the essays in this book, particularly those that are based on literary sources, do. So, for instance, even though he represents himself as a dasa, Harisena is not a servant, he is a high-ranking official, a member of the elite. Okay? To take another example, let's say from a more kind of contemporary context, if a woman tells her husband, मैं आपकी गुलाम बन के नहीं रह सकती, right? It doesn't actually mean that she's a slave, or if the prime minister of the country exhorts us all to overthrow the shackles of 1200 saal ki gulami, right? We have to take these kind of utterances as what they are, that is that they are rhetorical acts and figures of speech. So while I am in agreement that the everyday and the anecdotal bear the imprint of the deep past, as historians it's also important that we understand how terms and context change over time, right? And in the case of South Asian social history, over the very long time. So in this regard, one of the rather interesting themes that comes up in the essay is the framing of the figure of the master or the mistress. And this is something that the essays in fact do rather well, whether it is in the codes for ethical comportment in the akhlaq text or the experiences constituted as normal, right? How you would normally treat a servant or a slave in letter writing manuals. We can see that the power of the master is discretionary and it is at best subject to social control, which is something that changes in the colonial period. So in this regard, it seems to me useful to think of like another term that has a long history, jajman, right, which comes from the Vedic yajman, but the yajman of the Vedic ritual is completely different in meaning to, the yajman of a feudal social structure. And I think these are long-term histories that actually need to be addressed in terms of the sensitivity to text, context, and a changing time. They also have to be addressed, as several essays in this volume do, in terms of the interrelationships between caste, class, gender, status, and power. But one of the things that is actually happening in the essays that I've looked at in this volume is that they're often looking at urban or in courtly worlds, right? So how does the conversation about servitude change if we then start mapping rural worlds, right? And this is something that we have to consider in the long term of South Asian history. It's not just the figure of the master, it's also the figure of the mistress, right? And several very, very interesting essays in this collection help us understand women as agents of repression, right? Even as they are oppressed and implicated in social hierarchies. So as I like to tell my students very often when we look at the story of Draupadi's disrobing in the Mahabharata, she does not question the existence of slavery. She only questions whether she can be enslaved after her husband has lost himself, right? So the nature of those terms of reference are actually very interesting if you look at texts in the context of these times. Given these, many overlapping hierarchies and relationships, there is, of course, this question of how we excavate the possibilities of resistance. These could be, as the editors tell us, in laughter, language, gesture, speech, places of access. They could also be in insolence, insubordination, and gossip. But when we look at the sources, one of the things that we constantly have to ask is whose perspective is reflected, right? So humor, for instance, can often be a rather double-edged sword. To take an example, if we take the story that is told in this volume, which comes from the Pali Chronicles of Nanda, who is said to be a servant of a young Gahapati, who's been entrusted by the young man's father with the details of buried wealth. The young man wants to gain access to the wealth, which is this buried treasure, but when they reach the spot, the servant stands on that mound and starts abusing the master, saying, "You servant of a Dasi's son, how could you have any money here?" But whenever he he gets off that spot, the servant returns to his servile nature. Fine. Eventually, after this pattern is repeated a few times, the master realizes that the spot on which the servant speaks this way is where the treasure is buried. Okay. This is a story that was clearly meant to elicit laughs from those who heard it. Imagine a servant taking on the airs of the master. Better set that right at once. But what is interesting is that almost the same story, structurally, is told in the medieval compendium of stories, the Singhasan Battisi, where the story is actually about how King Bhoja discovers Vikramaditya's throne, which is that this throne is buried in a field, right? And the farmer who is in charge of the field, whenever he gets onto that mound, he starts abusing the king, right? But no, he starts speaking words of wisdom, and then whenever he gets off, right, he returns to his servile state. So what does it actually mean when the same kind of story is being used over time, over a very, very long time? And what is it that changes between one telling of the story and the other, between one set of relationships of servitude and the other? Because when the same story is told in the medieval Sanskrit text, the relationship is between a king and a brahmana, right? So there's clearly a shifting set of registers, and it seems to me worthwhile underlining that the change is not just between the pre-modern and the modern, rather there's several changes within the domain of the pre-modern that we need to think about. More insidious than the question of resistance, perhaps, is the question of boundary crossing, right? Can these boundaries between master and servant be crossed? And who is it who actually ventures to cross these boundaries? There is a rather interesting Kannada poem from the 13th century, which is called the Yashodhara Charity. And it tells the story, though on the face of it, it is a biography of the king, who's called Yashodhara, of the queen's unnatural passion for the mahout, right? So the story fluctuates between these domains of fascination and horror, right? The point of the story, of course, is that you're meant to feel disgust at this king's love for a slouching slave. Queen's love, sorry, okay. Queen's love of for this slouching slave, bald with a dented forehead and with sore eyes. But the fact that this story was told and retold between the 11th and the 18th centuries shows that it is a theme that endures, and it is a fear that found repeated expression. It's not only women who engaged in such boundary crossing. A story from the Mazha Pravas of Vishnu Bhatt Godse Bhattji, which was narrated by my late colleague Aniket Javare, tells of a Brahmin who falls for the young daughter of a servant woman. He has a liaison with her, but he tells her that she can have liaisons with other men who court her so long as she takes the precaution of collecting their sacred threads. So the woman does this. Eventually the scandal breaks because the matter is referred to the king, and when this is done, the Brahman asks the girl to bring the pot in which she has collected the sacred threads and asks the people in society to identify whose thread belongs to whom. Okay, the king then says, this is a situation that's getting out of control. So he says, what do you want? And the man says, I request that he and the girl basically be allowed to leave town together. So even as we talk of a situation of, crossing these boundaries involving a social death, you do also have stories where people cross these boundaries, right? And there are a discussion of the implications involved there. Okay, finally, I think the question I want to dwell on is something that the editors of this volume particularly try to do, which is how is it possible to talk of a social history of South Asia in the long term? Of course, they admit that the essays in this book are mainly North India focused. So in that regard, as a project that clearly people are invested in taking forward, I think it's important to recognize that the region of South Asia is constituted by a range of cultural enclaves involving different types of societies, and we need to understand the interactions and hierarchies between them. So for instance, when my Punjabi colleague complains about her Jharkhandi maid Agnes, it is a conflictual relationship not only between mistress and servant, but also between tribe and caste, vegetarian and non-vegetarian, Hindu and Christian, right? So there's a whole range of oppositions that we sometimes might have to map. How well do they map onto the past is a question that is worthy of analysis, because a question that we could well ask is, what would it mean for an Adivasi to be a master? A.K. Ramanujan tells us the story of a Gond peasant whose servant saves his life, but despite that, the master dismisses him, right? And the moral of that story is, few people in that region Trustagond, right? So what do you read from that story? Do you actually read the fact that the cultures of servitude do not exist in that social setup, or where they exist, right? They are not conducted with the kind of intricateness and intimacy that they are elsewhere. Okay, so I think there are, of course, several issues that the book brings up which I can't dwell on, but I'm sure other panelists will. So to all those who are involved in this project and in the task of preparing these volumes, thank you for making so many of us think of these issues, and thank you for a project that expands the frameworks of our inquiry in so many ways.
Thank you. Excellent. Excellent. Fantastic. Farhad?
Well, I should begin by congratulating the editors and the contributors for this fabulous book. It goes without saying that recovering the past of the servants is a formidable challenge for historians, not just for South Asian historians, but historians world over. And one of the challenges that historians confront when doing a topic of this kind is the silences in the archive. And therefore, I think one of the achievements of projects of this kind is to rupture the silences in the archive and to give a voice to the voiceless. So that regardless of the content of the volume, this is in itself an important intervention in historiography. In rare instances where we do get the voice of the servant, we are still not sure if the servant can speak. We are still not sure if the servant had the requisite linguistic and epistemic resources to be able to articulate his or her experiences, interests, and aspirations. And therefore, I think it's important to ask a question that is raised by one of the contributors in the volume. Can the historians speak? Can the historians speak about the servants? Can the historians speak for the servants? Given the silences in the archive and our position, the position of the researcher, the position of the historian, the position of the scholar, can the historian speak for the servants? For this very difficult question, the answer is actually a very simple one.
Yes.
Not at all, no. Obviously a big no. And therefore one needs to recognize that this project, however good this project is, however brilliant this project is actually a fragmentary and partial account of the past of the servants. But even so, it still remains an extremely significant intervention. And I think I could see 3 or 4 important reasons of important interventions that this project seeks to make. The first thing is, the first important point that I could see was that drawing on varied linguistic resources and skills, the contributors in the volume draw out the connections between language, genre, and the representation of servitude and service in historical literature. That, I think, is an extremely important issue that comes up in this volume. You have an essay by Pankaj on Sanskrit. You have contributors doing Indo-Persian sources. You have contributors doing Rajasthani sources. But from their very respective, from their very distinctive linguistic positions, they raise issues of the relationship of language, genre, and the representation of service and servitude. There is no advocacy for cultural history in any of the contributions in the volume, but I still thought that the characterization of literary flourishes that celebrate master-servant relationship as a facade or a mask, something that is said in the introduction, is a wee bit reductionist. because it forecloses certain immense possibilities, certain extraordinary possibilities that cannot be taken up when you close that option out by dubbing it as as a mask or a facade. But having said this, I still think that it's an extremely important intervention in the sense that it looks at language, genre, and meaning formation in an interconnected frame of reference. The important point here is that the experience of service and subjugation is located in a multilingual cultural space, and that brings out the richness of the past of the servants. The second thing, you'll tell me when to stop. The second thing that did appeal to me was that the contributions, without exception, move beyond the master-servant dyad to connect the dyad with social institutions, ascriptive identities, and political change. And this, I think, is an extremely important method of doing history. And the result of this is that this intervention is not just about then, not just about the past of the servants. It is also making an important intervention in the social history of the period. This is, I think, an extremely important feature of this volume. In this context, I thought we need to mention some papers. I thought Pankaj Jha's paper was an extremely important intervention because it sought to connect servitude or service with the caste system, and brought out the linkages between servanthood and caste identities. Insofar as the medieval and early modern period is concerned, unfortunately, caste has been totally under-theorized, and therefore I think this is an important paper in raising substantive issues in the way we do medieval history. But when it comes to the Indo-Muslim cultures, the connecting point between servanthood and becomes slavery, and in that context, I think the paper by Sunil Kumar is extremely important. Sunil points out the transformation or the transition from bandagi, servitude, to service. But the tension between Naukri and bandagi being servitude and Naukri service, is ultimately resolved later in the period by service becoming a form of servitude. So that the Naukri or service is inflected through the category of servitude or bandagi, which actually draws our attention to the ambiguity, something that she pointed out too, ambiguity in labor services, ambiguities in experiences of subordination and marginalization. So that categories overlap, categories move from one domain to another. Sunil also points out as to how the category of bandagi is a category of subjugation in one context, but when the same category is used to invoke mystical experiences or is invoked in context defined by mysticism, this becomes a category of empowerment. So one needs to be attentive to content, but also needs to be attentive to the ambiguity in these categories and the malleability of how services move from one domain to another. Similarly, I thought the connections that some scholars, people like Priyanka, Gitanjali, and Shivangani, sought to make between servanthood and household was also an extremely important intervention, in the sense that they make a persuasive argument that one needs to be attentive to institutional changes in the structure of the household, as also changes in the distribution of affect and emotions in the household, to be able to understand the experience of domestic service in the early modern period. the point that I'm trying to make here is that domestic service is not seen as shaped by the master-servant dyad, but is seen to be located in social institutions and cultural forces. And this, I think, is an extremely important intervention that this book makes. Given the overlaps between slavery and domestic service, it may well be tempting to seize domestic service as akin to social death. An implied argument is there in some of the contributions, but I don't think that's very, very valid or very appropriate. Neither this could not be an argument that could be made either for slavery or service in the case of South Asian historical experience, for two reasons. One is that these relations transcend the dyad. They transcend the tie-up of the master with the servant, and they are therefore located in wider social institutions. Secondly, as the paper, I think you were the one who wrote that one, Calcutta? Yeah, the paper, as he is, this whole issue of servant crisis reflects or reveals the kind of agency that the servants had, because one of the reasons for the anxieties that the masters had with reference to the servant-master relationship was the inability to control them, inability to make them obedient servants. And the element of disobedience actually suggests the level of agency that the servants had in social life. So I think I'll end here and congratulate the editors once again.
Deepu? Yeah.
Well, so let me also begin by congratulating Nitin, and Pankaj, the triad, Bihari triad. Well, I found the book interesting. I'm only going to speak about volume 2. I've made some efforts to read the first volume, especially the introduction, but I'm just going to stick to the volume 2. It's ambitious not only for the subject matter, but also because I think what the editors have attempted and what many of the authors have attempted is to try and also speak about debates in historiography and around questions of agency and power. And one of them, I'm still wrapping my head around it, which is around the question of lateral agency. So someday I'll understand it, but clearly there are important questions about, is it simply about recovery of voice, or can you think about agency differently? Does agency have a history itself as a concept? So anyways, there are important questions there that many authors have asked. What I'm going to do is try and organize my thoughts on the different essays around three W's, and I'll speak about them in a moment, and how. So the W's are very simple. It is who, what, and where. And the who question is very similar to the question that Meera raised, which is who do we speak of when we speak about the servants? And as is evident in the essays, certainly the first set of essays, which is around the early years of the 19th century, where typical English households could have anything ranging from 10 to 30 servants, each doing a very specialized task from ayas to masalchi and chaprasi and khidmatkar, etc. Indian homes similarly have a whole range of servants from bawarchi to mali and others. But the interesting point is, by the time you come to the central essay of the book, central in the sense, the one right in the middle of the book, which is by Shalini Grover on expat communities in Delhi today, there is typically just one maid, who she calls the all-rounder maid. And what you get across these essays, therefore, is a certain transition that has happened, where the many servants give way to one or two servants. And that's a story that you can find across different essays. Not all authors have made the attempt to speak of it as that kind of a transition, but you can tease it out from the essays. Three broad points have been made about this transition. The first is something that the editors do in the opening essay, which is to say that some servants or some kinds of work simply fade away with time, with technology. So typically they write, for instance, once electricity comes, you don't need the pankhawalas or the bhishtis anymore. But once the car comes, you need a driver. So there's some relationship between technology and the kind of service that is required and the kind of service that are going to be present. There's also a suggestion that a distinction has to be made between servants who are imagined as part of households and those who come in for specific tasks. And among the latter are a whole range of women servants who in one of the essays, I think Prabhat's essays or Charu's essay, I forget now, there's a suggestion that men should be especially wary of these women who walk into the house from the Bhatyarin and the Paniharin to Dhobin, Nain, Gwalin, Teli, etc., which obviously means that if you read it the other way, there's always either the actual case of sexual harassment and violence or certainly the potential for it when it comes to many kinds of services that are rendered by servants in households. That's another point that comes through in the reformist literature of the latter half of the 19th century. There's another issue which comes through in the latter half, which has to do with how does one understand the relationship between the home and the public. Now, sanitation workers, for instance, Tanika Sarkar writes, were early attached to specific households. Now, once municipalities get set up, they become municipal servants and public servants, and many still continue to remain part of households. And the question, therefore, to ask is, in the sense of who do public servants count in our description of servants? Do private service providers count of the kind that we thought once the darji is out of the house, or do those kind of people count? And if they do or they don't, then for what reason? And I think that's a question that across several essays you can figure out. The one distinctive point about the who that the editors emphasize and several of the writers emphasize is that it has to do with the wage labor. And that one way of making the distinction between dependent labor inside households and people whom we call servants is those who are paid wage and those who aren't. But even here, there's some caution that Samita Sen suggests that we must maintain because of the affinity between slavery and domestic service. There's also a distinction between care work and stigmatized work that Nitin Verma suggests has probably been overemphasized. And in Prabhat's essay, which is using satirical literature from the 20th century, there's a frequent overlap of the figure of the wife and of the maid, suggesting that in several contexts the unpaid labor of the housewife could be imagined as no different from that of the paid labor of the maid or the male servant. This is also a point that is made by Charu. So basically what these different authors are suggesting is that there are ways of making the distinction, but you need to be very careful because quite often seva and seva bhav and naukri go together. So even if there's wage, these other things continue to be around. So that's the who question. So there's a broad category of people, and how do we go about recognizing who they are and how to write about them. The second W is about what, and what do servants do. Now quite obviously from the names that I read out, you can make out that there are specific tasks that they perform, but one of the beauties of this collection is that there are several unexpected contexts which you would not imagine, at least not immediately imagine, the tasks that servants do. So in Charu's essay, for instance, you find servants negotiating in the marketplace on behalf of women who employ them, and these are women who have come into property through some means, and they need these servants to go out into the marketplace and negotiate on their behalf. And similarly, in other essays, a couple of essays, you find the ayah who travels between India and England, accompanying the English family and the child. So these are people who travel a lot, and sometimes they go to Mauritius, they go very far. And in Shalini Grover's essay, you encounter the cake baking, picnic organizing, contemporary maid of the expat household. So clearly there's a range of tasks that servants perform, and my sense is probably by focusing much more on the who, the what question may have been a bit underplayed. And maybe there's more work to be done there. I mean, it's almost taken for granted what do servants do, but you could do more with it. There's also, I suggest, a very different question regarding the what, which is to ask what is being attempted in the various sources when the figure of the servant is being deployed. And this is largely drawing upon Carolyn Steedman's work on England, where she writes that domestic servants were used more than any other social group to write histories of the social itself. They were employed by all manner of legal theorists and political philosophers to think through the social and its history. And this is an insight that several of the authors pick upon to write about what is the project that is being attempted, what is it being written about. So for instance, the opening essay by Satyasika Chakrabarti is suggesting that the servant figure, both in text and in paintings, was deployed to think about the empire and about maintenance of intimacy and distance. And how do you do it? And Yana's essay on the training of the servant class highlights anxieties about distinguishing between British men and women on the one hand, and not only the natives, but also the European underclass on the other, which is often to be found in the city. So that was a project. And in Prabhat's essay, it's about anxieties about the Hindu social order or the emerging nation. And there you have a very interesting insight that sometimes that the nobility of the servant is used to critique the elite Indian and British. The idea being that these elite, indulgent Indian men and women will not be proper subjects of the nation, and so it's through the figure of the servant that their indulgence is questioned. The third W is where, and this is something that I'm very interested in. What is the space that we're talking about? And this is something that Meera also pointed out. It seems to me that most of the authors have taken for granted that this is an urban context. Some of the sources that they have referred to also suggest that it quite may well be a rural household, or certainly a household in a kasbah rather than a big town. So there's the question of whether it's a rural or urban context, whether it is a large feudal household or small apartments of Indians or of British or of the expat. And also the question of how do we pose the relation between the household in which the servant works and our own house. So if we take up the first of these questions about the broad spatial location, it would seem for the most of the essays, as I said, the Indian household is in Calcutta or the British household in Calcutta, and households in a range of mid-sized towns from Patna to Kanpur. And this urban setting, the essay suggests, has to do with histories of migration and of job opportunities, as also with changing architecture and housing stock. My own feeling, again, as with the what question, far more can be done with the where question in terms of locating where the service is being performed. What has been done in the essays is probably we get far more about the where within households. Okay, and there are some very interesting insights that are offer. For example, the difference between the kitchen and the toilet, both regarding the task to be performed and the servant expected to perform it, or the difference between the cook and the mehta, to put it simply. Who can enter the house, when, from which door? Where can dishes be washed and by what route shit taken out? These are important questions in locating the servant. So where is the task being performed? What kind of task is being performed? I think there's something to be done there, which many of the essays hint at, and maybe if one thinks of further work, these could be pushed. Quite clearly, these are issues that are tied to notions of racial and caste purity and pollution, as also hierarchies within the category of servants themselves. But it is also about what is considered the essential duty of the housewife, who must continue to perform certain tasks even if there are servants available, especially cook for the house, members of the household. The one suggestion that I have in this regard is maybe especially for those who did the later half of the 19th century, early 20th century, if they had looked at the question of hygiene, there is a lot available there in terms of how these relationships are changing over time, and maybe that's one entry point to think about the kitchen and the toilet, for instance. I would also suggest that perhaps the idea of time in relation to work can be pushed a bit more. There is a difference, say, between the baridai, who becomes a bari over a certain length of time, and somebody who comes to work for a limited period of time, let's say for a couple of hours in different households. There's difference between the servants who have been attached to one household over generations, and those who are more contractual in the sense that we know of contracts today, or indeed, as Jana suggests, for some lower class European women, domestic service simply being an interlude between education and marriage. So there are the different notions of time here at play, and these are the ways in which it can be woven into the story of the servants. Many, I say, have done this, but perhaps not as self-consciously as could have been done. So these are three W's, the who, the where, and the what. And then the final question is, therefore, how? How do we read all this? There are three main sources that the authors suggest, the editors suggest. There's the judicial archive, there is the advice literature, both for Indian women and for British women, about how to treat the servants, and then there's a whole bunch of visual and literary material in which servants figure either as major or minor presences. And these are used by almost all the scholars to ask a range of questions. From a historiographical perspective, I thought Nitin Verma's essay was the most ambitious, trying to write, asking the question, what do these fragmentary court accounts allow you to tell? What kind of stories? How do you relate micro-histories to global processes of empire formation and mobility? And those kinds of questions. I thought he took on some of those questions head on and tried to do something with it, which was good reading. There are obviously a lot of other interesting things in the book. I would highly recommend that you can go and buy your copy or wait for a non-commercial copy, which might take time, but arrives in time. It's no choice. I would not recommend anything that would take away from the publisher's efforts, but definitely it's worth a read. Take your time and do go through them. I have two or three concluding observations. Sure. And I'll just wind up. The first is around the periodicity that is being addressed. The first set of essays is around early 19th century, mostly ends by about 1830s. The last set of essays is around first decades of the 20th century. And there's a whole period between 1830s and 1890s that goes completely unaddressed. One reason could be, as in any rated volume, the authors have different interests, and maybe the authors who contributed to this volume have their interest in these periods. My own sense is that perhaps it could be for a different reason. My hypothesis is, just reading this book, that maybe the English household question was resolved in the early years of the 19th century in the same way that the Indian woman question was resolved, as Partha Chatterjee says, in the closing decades of the 19th century. And that's why those two decades then become more fascinating for historians to write about, or it is simply a gap that editors are better placed to tell us why this exists. But it is a gap that exists. The second observation that I have is around mobility. My sense is that much of the literature that is examined by the authors assumes a bounded household, where the master of the house is stepping out for work while women remain confined inside. But almost all the essays hint that this is not quite the case, certainly not in the 20th century, where many more women are stepping out of homes to work as teachers, to work as social workers, as political actors, doing a range of things, which means that the assumed presence of the mistress in the household, constantly there next to the servant, is not always the case, and which should lead us to ask different kind of questions. So when Meera thanked the people who helped her put this together, clearly this is not the same mistress of the kind represented in these essays who's constantly inside the house, just looking after the household work. Several other essays suggest also that servants maintain their own homes, which also means there's a mobility between the site of their homes and the site where they work, which is another thing to look into. And of course, mobility across the empire, as I said, which again is something that can be considered more head-on. My final quick point is regarding the sources. There are three major sources that I said that the authors have looked at. But if you take these questions of where and what seriously, my sense is that even more conventional sources, simple annual sanitary reports, hygiene reports, housing reports, all of them have a lot to offer, and newspaper advertisements on new housing products, etc. There's a lot that can be mined there. It doesn't need some extraordinary source or some very different kind of source to be able to recover this history. But if we ask different kinds of questions of more familiar sources, we could still go a long way. But that would be about another book. Ashish Nandi is not here. He always says, "Bhai, sab kuch ek hi kitab mein likhwa loge kya?" So, he says that. So we will wait for those other books. In the meanwhile, thank you very much. And,
Thank you. Before I just open it for discussion, I had just two points to kind of think. One is about following Dipu's, I would say, 3 L's about language, about law and labor. Okay. 3 W's, 3 L. It's true. The question of law is quite crucial and central. But I'm saying it's very much a part of the way they have, not just in terms of sources, but also in conceptualization. I think it's very, very central, and it requires a particular way of looking. My suggestion, one is that even though we are out of all this, it's still the master-servant or the master-slave dialectic remains a template for understanding both the transformation of this relationship, how, in a sense, Hegelian dialectic, which allows for the servant to, or slave to become the master, even if it's, and even the transformation, internal transformations. But it's a very rich template which has, which is part of our modernity, and which has law in the sense of what constitutes the core of this relation. Is it just a personal domination? Is it personal structures of affinity or say relations of affect, however cruel or however gentle it might be? Or is it something which, and I think it's lot of the discussion in the book, and especially in the introductions in both the book, have actually focused a lot around this, on the question of law and its link to it. Is the master-servant, because this is the main thing, why has domestic labor been out of legal regulation for a long time? Is it a result of a neglect? Or as they suggest, following an interesting trajectory of thought, is that it is not outside the purview as so much as something which is within the purview of the law. Law shapes this relationship, but not by directly bringing it in. In fact, by shaping the household, by talking of the household as different, in some sense it already brings in. And this is the point of, it's a complex relationship between law and the way personal relationship is. And that is, I think, very much there in our, it's only now, in 2011, that the International Labour Organization has managed to bring law or the domestic labor into a set of conventions. Our labor law doesn't have it. To take the question of where is labor formed, is the household a site of work? The modern conceptions of labor have taken out the household from the site of work, but since last 30 years, work has returned to the household in a massive way. And that has also transformed the relationship. So that's why we don't have a labor law about household, but we have a sexual harassment at workplace law in India, which actually defines the household, also the child protection laws, which define the households as sites of work. So this relation between law and labor remains a central relationship, and it is actually very well, but I think it is a relationship of tension. It is, you suggested, in another context which I wanted to follow, about questions of ambivalence. How long can we carry on using spectrum and ambivalence to look at changes and transformations? How long would we look? Is it just a way, I'm suggesting that we might think of the question of changes and transformations both within, say, the so-called large pre-modern, but within the modern also, in terms of a category which is much less used, but in terms of what we call sublation, by which the part of the old is continuous and preserved at the same time as it abolished. A simultaneous abolition of structures, so that means the relationship between slavery, service, servants, and free labor, which is the standard spectrum, we must look at the interrelationship between them. So that is where I think, and not just across space or across categories, but over time also. So without, that's why we have the problem of, finding slaves certainly returning back. Now the word modern slavery. Or we have forgotten that many of our words have roots in slavery which have been transformed. Like Bandagi, you showed how Sunil has shown through that period. But the most famous one is ciao, the Italian word ciao, which is so common now, saying hello or bye, was a word for saying I am your slave. The word is actually from slavery, and it has been transmuted and transformed over time through this. So how do you understand the central question they raised about language? What is it actually the language does? I think there were lots of interesting ways in it has been dealt with. I don't think it will ever be fully done, or it could be reduced to. So I have these two ways of thinking about that. Just like transformations of relationship over time. That means I want to make a distinction between master-servant or servant as a category, social category. That means a sociology of servant and service, which is one kind, but another is about relationship. I think the authors in this book are focused around relationship. These are two distinct but interlinked structures, and we must understand that. When we look at relationship, that's what happens. You stand on top of a mound and you behave like a master. It's about relationship. It's not about the category, sociological category of who exactly is the servant in terms of what do you call him, what is the name. If I think the focus has been on relationship, there is a tension between the idea of relationship of master-servant and the question of what constitutes, who are the servants in some sense. But I think it's a productive tension and it works. I want to end by saying that it truly does open up many ways. It doesn't, as often happens, a critique of the older categories and older forms closes off certain possibilities. I think what the book has done in most of the essays, both in the first volume and second, is to kind of open up in new questions. Not all of them are satisfactory now, but and I also want to remember Nitin Verma, if he was around, the third musketeer, but whatever. I really would like, because I've seen them, both Nitin's, grow through the work in organizing this project, thinking about the project and working through this project, and I must applaud the work all three of you have done. Thank you very much. Do you have some questions, or not questions, discussion? Yes. Shahid, yes. Comments, yeah. Yeah, you can. You want to take this?
Just a set of very, very short comments. One is the kind of a overlap between service in the religious sense of the term and service and the whole history of service, so that now private universities are service providers. And I think, the bandagi or seva is something that we should talk a bit more, especially work on popular culture and a kind of hierarchy of powerful being that would help you either with kasht or klesh, or, so that Sankat Mochan is a particular, so that in say, Susan Wadley's work, there is Bhakti, Seva, Kripa, Vardhan. Now, this is a kind of a religious, universe, but this idea of having served a particular household for a long time and therefore you have a different position, that might be interesting. The other, of course, has to do with the purchase that the term servant has with regard to systems of state and control. So that, hence the word civil servant, or the pradhan servant, as the case may be. But for instance, and how especially say in police, the idea of servitude is actually, the matahati is inbuilt, so that even the way you sign a letter to a superior in police is to talk about fidvi. Now, fidvi is the same word that leads to fidain, but there are certain structure of bureaucratic structure where perhaps because of the chain of authority has to be strictly enforced, that you have these terms. I mean, I was very interested in what Deepu said about women, household, and the lax way of treating them as sexual objects or their laxity. And I think the central spatial metaphor is of the dowry, whether you are crossing the household, so that you might have people like Ahirian or even the Khatkin who are selling wares either away or just on the threshold, because and the more inside you come, the greater is the risk of having been cornered and sexual. So that I can remember some of this is actually reflecting on past experiences, but whether the historian can feel or write, this historian can definitely reflect. And so that the women who were supposed to be most immoral, quote unquote, available, were the one that came into the kitchen to sharpen the sill. Because periodically you have to have somebody coming with a sickle and hammer so because they come right into the very interior of the family. And I just thought of a kind of a distinction between the servants that you inherit, and hence the complaint कि वो हमारी अम्मा जहाँ थी वहाँ से we can't really bring the servants over here, and the kind of familiarity over certain generation, but yet the perseverance of a difference, so that if there is a name of the servant, especially in East UP and Bihar, you have to add a demeaning wa to it. Hence, there was a person who's called Phatkarwa, because the household that he came in had a vakil, and his name was Vakil. And on seeing hearing commentary, there was a guy called Phatkar, so he was not called Phatkar, he was called Phatkarwa. The other thing in terms of sources is I've not read the book, I've just seen it. As they say, difficult to judge a book by its cover. But there's very little I heard about literature, and it's because literature.
Lots.
But in the comments that so, and I think that I heard the word mama somewhere, or women actually shopping for women in a kind of a parda nishi household, and there's a term for that which is mama, which I didn't really know who does Sauda Suluf. And if you look at Miratul Urus, which is the story of the good girl and the good housewife, and the importance of somebody who negotiates and buys things on behalf of the head of the household, which is a woman, is very, very important. I think that what I heard, that perhaps there should be more kind of a cultural. I didn't hear anything. I'm just going by comments about the Victorian household,
That is,
and what happens with the kind of changes that take place, and of course, the sense of the disappearance of normal networks of service at a place which come about with the ownership of individual houses, say, in housing society and so on and so forth, which is, so I just, I'll look at the back jacket as well. I mean, I've just looked at the cover, and this is, and in response to some of the things. Sorry to have taken some time.
Good, great. Yes, please.
Thank you. Again, like Shahid, I've not read the book, but from the panelist discussions, I seem to find that there are some omissions or areas which have not been looked at. One, Meera has highlighted that South India is missing. If South India had been there in focus, perhaps the authors would have looked at the unique institutions of South India, the big temples, the mutts, and their great hierarchy of servants.
Temple
And
servants.
again, it is something where servants and slaves, the distinction becomes very very imprecise at certain points. Again, if you begin with the temples and the mutts as a social unit, you are struck by the way that servants are organized along pure and impure tasks, and pollution. And I suspect in the book, at least from what the panelists have chosen to highlight from it, it is the bottom end of servitude, which is scavenging, leather work, or the polluting tasks, which certainly find very little reflection in literature and do not find any normative manuals. There is no manual on how to be a good scavenger. So until we come to the British period and we get the hygiene reports and things being published, we don't have many literary sources before that. So that remains a sort of area of darkness. And if you begin with the temple approaches and the mutt approaches, then there is, in fact, some literature on some of these activities. But this remains an area where the Shahid has already raised the question of the police. But one of the puzzles of history is when you read the military histories, you're always amazed by two things in Indian history of the medieval and the pre-modern and modern period. One is the enormous amount of non-combatants in every Indian army. So if you talk in terms of a teeth to tail ratio, Indian armies have very long tails. And they have an enormous retinue of servants accompanying them. So now this has been studied to some extent. It continues to influence the way governance is organized in South Asia. You have military backmen, they've now become Sahayaks and so on, but they're not Sevaks any longer. But it's a social norm. And the other thing which puzzles you in the military history, what the hell happens to all the slaves who get captured? Because every battle produces large amounts of human beings as booty. So I think how are the slaves absorbed into the system of servitude is an area where I find I'm always being totally puzzled as to what happens after the battle. I mean, where do they go? Do they go into royal households? Are they distributed like that? Thirdly, again, perhaps the book touches on this. I'm only speculating, not having read it. Agrarian service. This is one of the very dominant forms of servitude.
Yes.
And this is at the heart of that debate about is this a feudal system, is it not a feudal system? I mean, this whole goes on about are they slaves, are they wage slaves, are they debt slaves? What kind of servitude is this? But your mode of production in agriculture is very firmly based on labor and having owners who do not touch the land. So it's a very peculiar mode of production, and I think these things are not questions for sheer historians to remark on. I think they're very important items of research. When we come to the modern corporate culture in India, which is what you do at IIMs and you look at human organizations and organizational efficiencies, it's remarkable the amount of fairly useless servants even our big companies employ. And again, when you're talking in terms of teeth and tail ratios, Indian companies have very long tails.
Wow.
And this is not just government research laboratory, this is the private sector. So when we start speculating why we don't produce an MNC in India, why we don't have an organization whose efficiency is up to international or global standards, why we're not world beaters in the private sector, or why is our private sector not, it is the existence of this large pool of servitude, of semi-servitude, and wage slavery or whatever, where you're just carrying people who are contributing very little to organizational output. This is to organizations throughout it. So it's not that this story ends with the historical survey. It's a carry forward into the modern period, and it changes its relationship. But so the question I'd like to put, if any of the panelists could enlighten me, have any of the essayists looked at the real numbers? I mean, in the case of the military, we do look at teeth and tail. But in terms of, any organization which is studied, why is the tail so long? I mean, there's a historical tendency, and does it diminish over time? Does it, in organizations, how does it change? How does it affect the efficiency of the organization? I think these are some of the questions which come to mind when we talk about servitude.
Thank you. There are some about global numbers, there are some figures about how many servants are there.
Who's the person who carries this?
Yeah. It's not there. Anyway, any more questions? Yes, Sunil, yes. He has
So where does the soldier end? Where does the game begin? That's the part we always worry about. And it's interesting that you pose this question because you're always, you're reading things back retrospectively. So that's one problem there. The other thing that, that concerned me a great deal is about the household. It's exactly the same kind of situation. When is it a household? When is it a courtship? Where do you draw the line and say you're not a part of my household, you're outside? And actually, if you were to tell someone or make this kind of statement that you're outside the household, you're completely demonstrating the strength that is perhaps accessible to you. So you never do that. But for the historian, it gets to be a really hard category to work with because I think here we didn't actually notice this so much. So for example, if you take a look at the pre-modern world, you talk about slaves who wind up as wazirs, and you go that way through. Now, but when you work that your way through and you say servants, service. But when you talk about servants in the 19th and 20th century, you never talk about the ICS officer. You never talk about the IS officer. You never talk about their backgrounds and their household. And I think, your point is actually very well taken here in that context, where you're talking about, service in a household and the servants who step away and they have their own households and they're producing their own hierarchies and so on and so forth. So, it's that kind of a multiple relationship that you have to keep in mind. So when you go back into the pre-modern period, going back to the thing about law being so, so difficult to prescribe in terms of, legal situations, not situations.
Household as a category actually is very much has been, economists use it now as opposed to individuals. Now households have become units for analysis and all, but it is still, it's like an aggregate of individuals. It is not the household that we are talking of, the household which has extended, which has many hierarchies internally, and that's one of the criticism of that. But there's a point which I wanted to open up also around this question. First is about this mobility. I mean, in the book, there is actually a discussion around the possible mobility even within the so-called, more flexible pre-colonial, pre-modern world where you can become a wazir. Only maybe 0.000001% of the pool of the slaves would ever have a chance of becoming a wazir. Let's say, though Indrani Chatterjee has just written an interesting piece showing how the British law actually, as long as Portuguese slaves or slaves brought by Portuguese could have access to the older style where they could rise some of it over time becoming free ultimately, or even if they don't become wazir, that is stopped in a way by the way the British actually emancipate the slaves. In fact, it allowed that social mobility, the route of social mobility, however rare it was, is stopped precisely because now there is no route, possible route from being a slave to having to be incorporated into the kin and finally being free in that sense. Possibility that, even though it was a very rare possibility, but that existed, and so it's a very interesting piece of article. But I still think the one question which to my fellow panelists and to everyone now, for instance, this question of when you think where are the big breaks which are happening? One is in the book, Pankaj's in the long introduction, between the early standard, changes from the 8th, 10th century onwards, proliferation of castes, whatever, the rise of feudalism, but whatever, contested form. And then you have another with the coming of the Muslim or the Indo-Sultanate, and then you have the colonial. Mughal is kind of an extension, but there are all these historical points of transition. We are looking at how the thing about slavery or servant or service changes over time in this how new groups are incorporated or now roots are stopped. I'm just wondering, in the book itself, the standard method is somehow to go from continuity versus change. So we are stuck between continuity versus change. We've seen historiographically, we've seen not to know how to look at this slave, which is now not a slave, which is now returned back as a modern slave. We seem not to know. We can only think in terms of something has continued and something has changed. How do you really, and there are certain ways in which the book has opened up certain ways of looking, especially when the question of law, for instance. Isn't the idea that before, or many times you have written, and I don't know if Farhat would, as if before the coming of the British, there was nothing called a contractual law, or that, the relationships were not contractual. The contract, modernity, contract, everything comes with the British, and before that, so the Calcutta labor market is like now you have free bargaining, as if before that there wasn't. As if that bargaining wasn't there, even as if contract wasn't there. That's the, the idea that law somehow comes with this modern and not in the pre-modern in some sense. There remains a tension in the book about, though you have shown how, two of the essays are directly about court records in the pre-modern period, or using of contract, for instance, Zaidi, what's his name? Rizvi. Yeah. So I was just wondering how have you looked at these two questions of change and other legal structure. I mean, you should jump into the literature thing. You can cover. Yeah. Pankaj.
First of all, I must, on behalf of the editors and contributors, thank all of you, the panelists, the chair, and everyone else who has spoken. We couldn't have asked for more, because if so many of the finest minds here find so many interesting, meaningful things to say about a volume, the volume must be perceived as doing something interesting and meaningful in turn. I have a few remarks to make primarily in response to what has been said. Not all of it, but some of it which I found interesting. One question is, to begin with, was that was raised by Meera about the dynamism of relationships and terminologies, which I think we have tried to flag. Yes. In fact, if you look at the end of the introduction, that's the note on which we end, underlining the fact that, underlining the inherent somehow instabilities in the taxonomy that we often use and take for granted. So the kind of relationships that they are trying to reflect upon these terminologies in our sources actually cannot be pinned down and defined primarily in linguistic terms, unless one looks also at the context and the genre of the source, the context in which the relationships are flagged, and so on. So that point, however, obviously remains, and I thought Meera flagged it rightly. The other question was that Farhat was raising, which is again something that the editors actually thought and discussed at length, sometimes on Skype, which is the question of mask. That you mentioned, the terminologies that often seek to mask these relationships. If you notice, we have used the word mask within quotes, and we have tried to question it. In fact, in one place it says this mask is interwoven with the structure of hierarchy, affinity, and inequality as they have been historically constituted. So obviously, one of the things that we were keenly aware of was the fact that we are trying to map out, almost as you said, can the historians speak for the servants? We are trying to map out a field of research which is impossibly scattered, which is impossibly underworked, and which is impossibly distant in terms of not just language and epistemology, but also in terms of the methods as of now available to us. So we were keenly aware of that handicap, and in spite of that, if we took on the audacity of taking this up, then I think the difficulties have to be flagged. I mean, primarily, I think the introduction hardly says much about what is, about the three W's, one H and three L's. It primarily flags difficulties. It primarily flags difficulties of dealing with these W's and L's. I guess so the problems that all of you have raised are very valid issues. Which also brings me to the last question of literature, and continuity and change. Now, I think I would like to relate that to what Meera had rightly pointed out, which is that, and which the where question brings out, which is that when we think about continuity and change, there is a very strong urge in all of us, especially those of us who have studied in Delhi University, to think in terms of continuity and change across time spans. And there are some standard moments that we think of: 6th century BC,
18th century,
7th century AD, 12th century, 16th century, 18th century,
18th
and so on. One of the things that we were very clear about was the fact that we are not doing any such linear diachronic history, because we were also keenly aware of the fact that locations, when we talk about locations, where, it's not just a simple geographical or even eco-cultural location. We are also thinking location in terms of sources, the representations. That is one important coordinate of the locations. So in many senses, what we have done in a very, very scattered temporality is simply flag some of the areas and express regret about others which we have not been able to flag. When we say continuity, we usually assume that there is one thing called India or North India, as we have acknowledged, and then there are these continuities and change that you can map. So one of the things that, for example, in the context of feudalism debate that we forget is the fact that when we discuss these sources and these inscriptions and agrarian scenario on whether there were serfs or not, is what we forget is the fact that we are talking about probably not more than 5 to 10% of inhabited agrarian area. The rest of the inhabited area is not represented in this feudalism debate. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that we, the editors, were also, and I guess the contributors, were aware fully of the fact that continuities and change cannot be mapped across such widely varied temporalities and cannot be understood primarily in terms of a linear, consistent taxonomy where you can say this is the moment of transition.
Right, yes. Okay, yeah, just before, yeah, Deepu. Deepu's, yeah.
Interesting, which I thought I'd point out, because, there is implicit in several of these essays, but two essays I'll flag in particular, which ask the normative question. And the normative question itself has changed over time. So the first normative question is, how should you treat your servants? And then there's a whole body of literature around that, which becomes the most complicated when you come to socialist writers, who are always writing about equality, etc., but also have a retinue of servants that they have to reflect upon. And in Prabhat's essay, you find a very detailed reading of it. And I think it can be probed a lot more in terms of, because this is very different from advice literature about how you should treat your servants. This is about men and women who profess to be socialists, believe in equality, etc., but live with servants and reflect on that condition. This question, by the time you come to Shalini Grover's essay on the contemporary, has completely changed. And the question now is it okay to have servants? Is there something morally wrong if you live with servants? And you find in her essay almost all expat families trying to find ways to justify that if we have servants here, it is because about conditions in Delhi or India. In normal circumstances, we would not have servants. So there's a lot of weight attached to these normative concerns in thinking about servants, which I think is also usefully flagged in some of the essays, and I thought I'll just
and also
bring it
by
up.
saying middle class historians, servant employing historians cannot write about servants. That I thought was below the belt. Like saying all subalterns are NRIs, so they can't write about subaltern history. So, yeah. Yeah, you wanted to say that, yes.
not even remarks, it's just like sharing what we had thought at that time and how the project itself developed. But thanks to all of you for bringing out the points which are there in the book. When we started this project 4 years ago, we were always anxious about sources. It's not that we didn't know what kind of sources we would start with, but there was this sense of anxiety that that there are not enough sources to actually construct a larger picture around the issue of domestic servants. And over a period of time, we realized that the problem was of plenty, not of shortage. They are everywhere, as you said. Even if we read our regular sources with new questions, we will see them. So the question was not of shortage, it's actually still a question of plenty. We find them everywhere, in every genre, in visuals, in different types of literary material, but it depends how we find them. We find them in the main text of judicial depositions, and we find them in footnote of a didactic Hindi text from 1920s, where you read 50 pages and then you will see that this is how the wife should behave with the servant of the household, and that's one sentence. And then you realize that, okay, this is a servant-bearing household. So it depends how you find them. Largely, the nature is fragmentary. So that's one thing about sources. And perhaps some of the younger scholars would take this up, and I really like the way the two papers on that the household sources are used to write that history. The second thing is about mask. I share with Pankaj the anxiety of being misread there, precisely because of the fact that we should not be dismissive towards the mask. So the making of the mask is the making of the historical relationship itself. So we can't understand the master-servant relationship without acknowledging the presence of the mask. Or the hidden script, that's another thing which we have worked with in the introduction. But yeah, that's a small quibble. The third thing about question of numbers, extremely difficult. I have been trying to make sense of the numbers of domestic servants, say in Calcutta between 1760s and 1810s. It's very difficult. Any kind of quantitative methodological input, okay, can we have a sense of the number of Europeans first in the city? Because then we can know that a high-ranking European household would have at least 30 to 35 servants going by the prescriptive list. And you do all your mathematics, and still it doesn't make much sense. Numbers become a bit more available, or at least available to speculate with the coming of the census, but there again, there's a lot of problem, as Saurav has been working with census materials and servants, and we are encountering a lot of problems on that issue of enumeration. So it's a very difficult question. In fact, in the contemporary time, the range is somewhere between
2.5 to 90.
90. From 3 millions to 90 millions, that's the range in which domestic servants are perhaps. That's the 2011
For India,
figure.
for India.
For India. So it's very difficult. Continuity and change. I do think that as students of history, we do want to make sense of when things qualitatively change, as in we see the emergence of new patterns and new structures, and why did they emerge. But one of the things which we did in the introduction, discussed over Skype chats, was that we are, and I think we used that phrase, that we will create some temporal harakiri. And we have clubbed in examples from 1820s and 1980s in one paragraph. The idea is not to, again, dismiss the shifts or the changes or the transformations, but to capture the gradedness of it. Now, one can perhaps think more around the issue of how to further concretize the processes of gradedness, but that was the phrase we were thinking through, that rather than thinking about continuity and change, we were thinking of graded nature of past. Right. Yeah, that's it.
Yes, Naveen, yeah.
When you think of servant class, there is an assumption, I would assume, that the category of servant continues, but the relationship changes. So that could be one way of looking at. And the way could be that the servant and the relationship both as a category and the relationship transforms. So, and which is partly, I would say, is the case. So there has been work where this transition from servants to worker, for example, has been identified and argued. So both the category and the relationship does transform. But when it appears here, so I'm a bit. I would like to know that why servants. Does it mean that the some ways either servants or the relationship of the servitude or of certain kind continues? So when you're writing it now, so later in the history, or you would suggest that there is the continuity in the sense that the particular relationship, of course, with not in the a historical way, but it remains. So that's the puzzle. Why servants past? Why not servants in the past? Because servants in the past probably are different from servants later. So how would you respond to that? And second thing, it just reminded me of an interesting book that was written about South Africa post-apartheid.
Yeah, so would you like to, some of them would like to?
बात कह देता हूँ. I think the only difference I can see is between an antiquarian approach and a genealogical approach. One of the things that, one of the issues that one could, one always felt anxious about is the gradedness of past. When we talk about gradedness of past, we also mean a certain kind of not an anthropological, ethnographical kind of recovery of past in the present, but a deep awareness of how some of those gradedness might have had a continuity. So when we talk about servants' pasts, we are also flagging the plurality of these pasts, to the fact that servitude, servants, and the attendant relationships and locations, all of these have had histories, and they continue to have histories. So some of our papers are also touching upon contemporary issues. So in some senses, this title perhaps reflects the audacious ambitiousness of the project, whereas pasts of servants would have appeared a little more benign and easy.
All right. So if there is no, yes.
One little thing, as I heard about the literary sources and using same sources for to write new histories, and Sunil's reflections are already there, and this slippage in the category of servants. There's this beautiful episode in Ramcharitmanas where you have Lakshman breaking the dhanush, and Parshuram comes in very angry, and there's a debate which we have all read in our school textbooks. So in that debate, Lakshman says, it's with a fake sense of politeness, Nath Shambhudhanu Bhanjani Hara hoi hai koi ek das tumhara. Must be one slave which has done this. He's not revealing, but obviously he knows. And then in his response, Parshuram, the angry Parshuram, says, Sevak wo je kare sevikai, ari karni kar karahi ladai. Something like that. So Das, while he addresses himself as Das, he shifts the terminology immediately, and he calls him Sevak. And then he dismisses him as Sevak also, because it's phony, You have to dushman ka kaam kar rahe ho. This is an enemy's act. So there's so much, to mine, of course. And you have started the process, and we'll continue mining those.
I wanted to invite some of the contributors are here in the room. So if they want to add something from their own perspective, I see three
Okay. So I'll just quickly add to what Sir said and what everybody was saying. The first time when I saw the call for the proposal for this conference, my immediate reaction to it was, I called a Farad sir and I asked, sir, are concubine servants? Can I talk about them in the category of servants? You know, these are women who are war captives also, who have been purchased. They worked as domestic servants, but then they rose to a position, to a elevated position, where they are also commanding servants, and they had a lot of prerogatives to themselves. So all the discussions that were happening today about what is this category of servant and how do we see servitude, I actually struggled through that throughout my essay also. And it remains, I think, there are amazing essays in this volume, and I think I'm still struggling with that category of what is a servant and who can we categorize as a servant or servitude. How do we do that?
Right. So, unless you have something. Yeah. No, I think it's being recorded, so maybe it's.
On the work, and
It's on.
and also probably because it kept on coming again and again about the quantitative. I mean, if we do get numbers in terms of servants being present in a particular. So just a little backdrop to what I'm saying. So I have worked on Rajput household in Jodhpur. So in my recent visit to Jodhpur Mehrangarh Fort, this is just to share. I mean, I could locate this Bahi, which was pointed out to me by the people who work there. And so you have this entire list of darzis. And it's called Hazri Register. So basically their day-to-day attendance is being taken in that Bahi. So they have not listed, they're not putting numbers there, but we do get names of all the darzis who were appointed at a particular time for a particular Rani. So probably we could connect the dots there and do the math and get the number.
Your period.
Yes. So this is roughly late 18th, 19th century Jodhpur. And yeah. So just, I mean, if we look more into it, and as most of us here pointed out, that this is still an area which has been opened up, and a lot more is to be done. So thank you everyone for your suggestions, because I think that's going to help us in relooking and rethinking our own present work. Thank you.
All right, I think you were satisfied with the. Or do you want anything more? No, we haven't come down to gloves haven't been taken off yet. Yeah, good. Okay, thank you so much for this, and wishing you all success to.
Success to the publishers.
Yes, yes. I hope you have it. Yeah, it should be part of. Which is what? Which is yeah.